Idriss. Good morning, Professor Miller-Idriss. Our event today focuses on hate in the homeland, how to understand and combat far-right extremism. We will talk about far-right extremism in communities in America and in Germany, how people are radicalized and why so many are attracted to violent movements. We will discuss events on Capitol Hill and recruitment of the far-right groups, from mixed martial arts gyms to clothing stores, online gaming chat rooms to YouTube cooking channels. And I'm really looking forward to that talk and also lecture by Cynthia Miller-Idriss. My name is Maike Zwingenberger and I'm the director of Amerikahaus Munich. And I have two groups that I would like to welcome, especially at the moment. My first special welcome goes out to our partners at the German American Institutes all over Germany. Our event today is part of our lecture series, das Ende des transatlantischen Raumes oder Raumes. And I send you all a warm welcome in Nürnberg, Freiburg, Tübingen, Heidelberg, Stuttgart, Köln, Düsseldorf, Kaiserslautern, Saarbrücken, Berlin, Leipzig, Hamburg, and maybe even Kiel. Wherever you are, a warm welcome to you. All of the former Amerikahäuser have been founded right after World War II with a focus on re-education and bringing democracy to the German population. And I think that is a very urgent topic today. So I wanted to actually start with the history of our institutions as the Amerikahauses and German American Institutes. Right in the center of these Amerikahauses were libraries with their books and newspapers as valuable sources and as attempts to fight against fake news, violent ideologies, and propaganda, right in the time after World War II and the Nazi time in Germany. And actually, when you think about it, the Check Your Sources program that we also need to talk about today started back then. So in our Amerikahäuser, or the German American Institutes, as they are called today, we have worked on that same topic for over 75 years now, and we need to do so more in the future. And that's why I'm really looking forward to our event with Professor Miller-Idriss today. My next special welcome goes out to our student groups who will join in a special conversation with Professor Miller-Idriss after the public event. So stay tuned, you'll get your chance to get involved in dialogue. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Miller-Idriss to you. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a distinguished professor at the American University in Washington, DC, an award-winning author and scholar. She is the director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. And I think we will talk a little bit about your work there, which is really important. She has testified before the US Congress and has briefed the UN Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee. She has appeared many times in the media over the last time, and that is because of her last book, but also because of her research that she did. And she writes a lot for foreign affairs for the New York Times and Washington Post. And we have sent around one of your great articles, Professor Miller-Idriss. Professor Miller-Idriss serves on the International Advisory Board of the Center for Research on Extremism in Oslo and in Norway. So she's also very informed about European problems in that same context. And part of her research has been done in Germany, actually. She's a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Tracking Hate and Extremism Advisory Committee. And as I said, her two most recent books, Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, and The Extreme Gone Mainstream, two wonderful books, which I have here, great covers as well, are not only in-depth analysis of the theme we are talking about today, but also very good reads. So I just heard that we have ordered the books for our ebook library, and I would suggest maybe for the other German American institutes to do the same thing. Very good reads. Professor Miller-Idriss has received numerous prizes, among them a fellowship from the University to Köln in 2013. That might indicate how important your research has been in Germany. You have been in Berlin and Leipzig and other places, and we have talked about the early period of your first research in 1999 and the year 2000, and then you returned for this book, The Extreme Gone Mainstream, in 2010, I believe, 2009. And you did a lot of in-depth research. So I'm really looking forward to having our conversation today, Professor Miller-Idriss, but we will start out with a short lecture and introductory talk from your side. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you, Frau Zwickenberger, for the very warm welcome. And thank you everyone for attending, for listening, and for being here. As was just mentioned, I have a long relationship with Germany. I studied abroad in Hamburg nearly 30 years ago and also lived in Berlin during my research and then later as a faculty member on a fellowship in Köln. And so have traveled all over and have done research there for many years, including writing 2 books. And it's been really the defining relationship of my life in terms of understanding cross-Atlantic, transatlantic ways to learn about responses to resurgent far-right extremism and what we can learn from each other. I'm going to share some slides. So I will talk today just for about 15 minutes so that we have plenty of time for question and answer. Let me just get this up to the beginning and start the slideshow. I do want to note, so I'm drawing just a little bit here. It's a very quick talk, so I will try to speak slowly and not get too excited, but also know there's a lot of other things I can go into in question and answer. So I'll just give you a little bit of hint of the kinds of things we could talk about. And I do want to note that I have some images here which are offensive and propaganda. And so I apologize for that. I have a whole lengthy discussion in The Extreme Gone Mainstream about why it's important to study images even when they offend, but it's worth noting. When we talk about what's happening in youth radicalization, I just want to define first what I mean by that. Radicalization is the process of coming to see the world as divided into us versus them. It's an existential way of seeing the world. And the other group is seen as posing a dire threat to your own group, to your way of life, to your future survival. And that is something that's happened for a long time to radicalization toward different forms of extremism, whether that's white supremacist extremism or Western supremacy, male supremacy, different kinds of religious-based extremism, Islamist terrorism, different kinds of us versus them divides. But recently we've had rapid transformations, particularly in where youth, but also older adults, encounter the extremist ideas and how they become radicalized. One shift is that there's a much more bottom-up and organically evolving kind of way that they engage with the symbols and signs of extremism, but it's also because there are changes in how those symbols are shared. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this. The use of wit and humor and sarcasm. And finally, what my new book looks at is these questions of where radicalization happens has radically changed. So it's not just a destination and sort of a backwoods militia or a neo-Nazi group in a particular neighborhood, but something that comes to where young people are in the mainstream, on mainstream platforms and new and changing physical spaces. So very quickly, what we saw in Europe and in Germany in particular, starting in the late 1999, 2000s, you had a shift away from the former racist skinhead scene into more mainstream brands and a shift away over the past decade from kind of soccer hooliganism to more of a mixed martial arts scene, and a shift from what had been far-right rock festivals and connections to more mainstream kinds of boxing gyms and YouTube cooking channels. So that's a symbol from Brooklyn, actually. But what we saw after that was the emergence of brands like Torsteiner in Germany that were able to code more symbols that became adopted, coded Nordic symbols that were popular, other brands that incorporated things like the word swastika, which is here, the Latvian word for hakenkreuz, into a t-shirt or into a sweatshirt that would make it legal, right, for lots of different reasons. And you'll see under on the right-hand side describing the quality of this product, it says rechtlich absolut unbedenklich, right? So perfectly legal. This is a use of playfulness in the coding that allows them to get around certain kinds of bans. And we finally saw things like the removal of vowels. This is in Dortmund in 2016, the removal of vowels from a word like Hakenkreuz, which of course started a whole legal discussion about, is the word a word if the vowels are removed? So this is the examples in Germany, but we see this elsewhere in the US. That same kind of iconography gets adopted in the language around a t-shirt selling here, white boy. So this is, again, for complicated reasons, using the Run DMC logo, which is a 1980s rap music group. And I can talk about that. But we saw that then in France as well on distributors that use the language here. If you spell out the name of this distributor, it's too white for you, right? Selling a variety of different kinds of clothing. And you also see the t-shirt below that takes Hitler's vowels out again. So that kind of removal and coding became a signal, as well as the use of kind of historical codes like Reconquista to refer to a 15th century pogrom against Muslims. So that's sort of what I analyzed and discussed in The Extreme Gone Mainstream. And by the time I turned that book in 2017, what had happened already was a shift from this t-shirt iconography to the creation of memes. And this made youth culture not only the consumers of different kinds of hateful iconography or messaging or codes, but also the producers. It created a much more organic and bottom-up way to do it. And so by the time you have Pepe the Frog, who gets co-opted by the alt-right, the so-called alt-right, for lots of complicated reasons, and then for even more complicated reasons, a flag emerges, right? So the code for online laughter is KEK, that evolved from LOL, laugh out loud. So KEK, someone discovers that there's an Egyptian god of the frogs named Kek, and decides that there's a mythical republic, a fantastical place, like a white ethno-state called the Republic of Kekistan. And Pepe is Lord Kek, right? Pepe is the head of Kekistan. This all sounds sort of ridiculous, silly online youth culture, but then that flag starts to show up at Charlottesville in the upper left corner, and in a demonstration in Brazil, in iconography about Australia, and in the center and in the bottom right at the US Capitol on January 6th. So that iconography, this flag that represents a white ethno-state that evolved from a joke that teenagers created about Pepe the Frog, a meme, evolves into offline symbols that signify something at an insurrection that refers to a future white civilization or demanding a white civilization. So that's, I think, a really important indicator of how youth culture can really drive and connect to offline violence. We see the t-shirt on the upper right-hand side saying meme war veteran. This is referring to the same kind of thing, how memes kind of connect and create this relationship between online culture and offline violence. We saw the same thing happen in the US with the Boogaloo Code, which again was started by teenagers online as a joke to refer to a 1980s, a very bad 1980s movie that was a sequel to another movie and sort of widely panned for being terrible. And Boogaloo became a code for the second of something. So whenever there's a second of something, and then it got co-opted to mean a second civil war. And then it moves into offline space as a code to call for civil war. And so you got these Boogaloo Boys groups emerging in 2019 into 2020, calling for, they even call it mimetic warfare or a meme-based insurgency, coupling it with iconography, like in the central patch here, with imagery of the Revolutionary War. They start to get banned online and they start using sound-alike words like big igloo or big luau. And so you see in the upper center, instead of boogaloo, it's big luau. Big luaus and Hawaiian luau's also feature pig roasts, and pigs are a slur against the police, as you see in that hat referring to a police agency. And they start wearing Hawaiian shirts to connect to the big luau and to show up at these rallies armed with Hawaiian shirts, which also is then a subtle threat against law enforcement. So you see again how this rapidly evolving set of signals, which start with youth culture online, evolve into offline violence. And now these Boogaloo groups or movements are connected to 2 deaths over the summer as part of the wave of anti-government extremism that's happened in the US. So again, here, it's not so much a group as what I call a mobilizing concept. It's like a hashtag that gets added to other groups. So you'll see the Proud Boys post something on social media with hashtag Boogaloo, which means call for civil war or call for insurgency. So in the context of January 6th, and an actual insurrection, I think it's really important to think about how these mobilizing concepts work and how they can motivate people offline and help pull them together into groups as a concept and as an idea, but also how they do connect back to youth culture online, which a lot of people just dismiss as unimportant, I think, or as something that people will grow out of. But I think understanding that online culture and offline violence as connected is really important. So I'll close soon just so that we can get to Q&A, but I just want to say that a lot of what we're seeing here is the weaponization of youth culture online by the far right, so that they are positioning themselves here in this t-shirt that says, we are not radical, we're just early, or using Pepe the Frog to refer to kind of Pepe fiction and a play off of the movie Pulp Fiction. What you see here is the far right having positioned itself as the counterculture to the mainstream, and that everybody else is just sort of a triggered snowflake who can't take the joke. And I think that's been a really important driver of a lot of what we've seen in the white supremacist extremist scene, in particular with the growth of youth engagement. And we have to understand that kind of backlash against the mainstream as part of the appeal, along with the coding and the symbols and the use of humor and jokes and wit that can give people a sense of power about being the insider who does get the joke while everybody else doesn't get it. So I'm going to skip a couple of these examples and just say that in the new book, what I do is I take up cases where I think these kinds of new spaces and places help cultivate different kinds of capital, actual financial capital through the sale of merchandise, but also cultural capital here through, whether that's through YouTube cooking channels that are, neo-Nazi vegan cooking channels, or other Instagram accounts that aesthetically make white supremacist extremism look pleasing, through the mixed martial arts. And this is, dedicated gyms in Ukraine and Canada and France that are either owned and operated or closely connected to far-right groups, with the propaganda in the US in particular, heavily targeting colleges. So you see this kind of on multiple levels, youth being sort of used by far-right groups to think about cultivating capital, whether that's cultural capital, using cultural channels that are popular with youth, intellectual capital for the future of the movement, or physical capital here in the disciplined warriors that are seen to be needed for kind of the street fights that will be a part of the coming race war. There are a lot of new risks in the COVID era, which I won't go into right now, but that just say, it's just important to think about the unprecedented amount of time that young people in particular have been spending online, along with increased propaganda that's circulated from extremist groups. And we have really been seeing this in the intersection with anti-Asian violence in the US, which I'm happy to talk about, and with the scapegoating of the virus, or of conspiracy theories about the vaccine as being either anti-Semitic or anti-Asian. And we have extremist groups kind of thriving in this context, along with, I should say, in the US, record-breaking gun sales over the past year, including even shortages of bullets and ammunition in certain parts of the country. And so we are now in a kind of perfect storm in the US, I think, of an incredibly high circulation of guns, along with people who have had very difficult circumstances over the past year and increased propaganda. So what can be done? I'll close with just a couple of more optimistic points. So I run this research lab now. We do a lot of testing of interventions. One of the things we're focusing on is improving the awareness of what we call frontline responders or frontline individuals, which includes parents, when we're talking about youth, parents and caregivers, but also coaches and teachers, other mentors and mental health counselors. And so together with the Southern Poverty Law Center, we are in the midst of creating a series of tools to create a more holistic response to help adults in children's lives better recognize and feel more empowered to intervene. And I think this is something that is much more common in Germany, but is really rare in the States. So we don't have sort of mobile Beratung, like mobile advisory groups. We don't have central sets of resources for communities. And so even when parents do recognize that someone is radicalizing, in the US at least, they often have no idea who to call or what to do. And so we're trying to change that and help people recognize what these are at the same time as providing evidence about how these do work. And so we just finished an impact study with 755 parents that studies when they read the guide, what happens? Do they improve their knowledge of far-right extremist or extremist propaganda? Do they feel more empowered? And we haven't published it yet, but I'm really happy to report not only did it improve parents' awareness and sense of empowerment on every measure we had, but the more minutes they spent reading the guide, the better they did on the post-assessment. So it really matters that they spend time with it. So in general, this kind of media literacy that Frau Zwickenberger was just talking about, and the need for online safety, it really empowers local communities and teachers and school districts and universities, I think, to take the reins here and in helping to understand how we can better equip and prevent young people and adults from being vulnerable to propaganda and scapegoating and online misinformation and disinformation, like we saw, for example, in this Stop the Steal campaign. Finally, we do have to talk about regulation of social media and technology and content moderation, but I will leave that to the question and answer so that we have plenty of time, because I know I've gone just a little over what I promised I would. So I will stop there, but I'll just say that I do all of my essays and writing is available on my website. They should be accessible, I hope. Sometimes there are paywalls that go up when I'm not aware of it. But under the essays tab, you can read the things that I've written. And our lab, the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, has tools that are free and downloadable, including that Parents and Caregivers Guide, which you can find along with Teachers and Educators Guide on the Boogaloo and animated video on the Boogaloo movement and other sorts of things like that. So please feel free to download or follow me on Twitter for other threads, etc. And I'm happy to answer questions. So let me stop sharing. Great. So I will stop there, I think, and we can go to the question and answer period, if that makes sense with you, Frau Zwickenberger.
Of course, thank you so much, Professor Miller-Idriss. I think on one side, we could stop here and let everybody find out about your, I think, helpful tools and learn more about what we can do. But on the other hand, we can't stop here because there's recent developments that I think we need to focus a little more on. And I know that you also have a lot of informative material and also in writing, you have also commented on recent developments, for example, with the riots on Capitol Hill. And what I like very much about your research is the aspect of mainstreaming that I think is really important to understand how that really works. That also then has a consequence in the political scenario, I think, and we need to talk about that, about the political structure and how the Republicans also on the right side, on the maybe far right side, but on the right side at least, are working with these kinds of codes and cultural and historical references. But first of all, I think that with the riots, we have realized that there is a lot of people participating. On one side, more women. That is something that is new. And I would like to ask you about that. And also, because you talked about youth culture, most of the people that we recognize in the images are rather middle-aged men or women, I would say. And a lot of them, as we know now, are either military personnel or have some affiliation with federal institutions, which is on one side surprising or maybe not. And so this would be my first question. What would you say about these recent, the recent knowledge that we have about the people participating in the extreme right violence that has occurred?
Great. It's a great question. I mean, and, typically I focus on youth for lots of different reasons. One is that historically youth are more prone to violence and more at risk for recidivism, like for falling back into it even after they have left movements. And the typical kind of far-right extremist attacks that happen in the US, not always, but more often, and are the perpetrators of mass shootings have been younger people, including this case in Atlanta just this week. But this is changing because the COVID pandemic has really shifted. The COVID pandemic, along with the election and the mass misinformation and disinformation that circulated about the election being illegitimate, really changed that. And so I do think one of the most, not surprising, but unusual things about the January 6th insurrection was the fact that we have 70-year-olds arrested and a lot of 50 to 70-year-olds. I mean, a lot of middle and older middle-aged people, along with a disproportionate number of veterans, at least a couple of dozen law enforcement officers themselves, and then a lot of people who were, regular members of society, right? Kind of not on the fringes, but employed small business owners, et cetera. And so I think there are a lot of, and more women. And so there are a lot of different ways to unpack that. So one, I think that's important to understand is that the dynamic that really predicts, I think, or explains far-right mobilization across the spectrum is what I call an intersection of precariousness and entitlement. So what you have with precariousness is a sense that something could be taken away from you, or a sense that you could lose something. And so we do know this research actually from Germany, but we have research in other places as well that confirms it. You're not more likely to join the far right if you're unemployed, for example. It's not the most disenfranchised people in society who become members of the far right, but you are more likely to join if you grew up in a household with an unemployed parent. So that experience of precariousness, of feeling uncertain or that something could be taken away, does create vulnerability to propaganda. That propaganda then says something could be taken away from you and given to someone else who doesn't deserve it. So that's where the entitlement comes in. It's something could be taken away to which you are entitled and given away to someone else who doesn't deserve it. And that same kind of narrative, we hear that with white supremacist extremists about losing a white majority country. We hear it with Second Amendment protesters that, Democrats are coming for your guns, or Obama was coming for your guns, right? Going to take away your gun rights. And we certainly saw it with the Stop the Steal propaganda around, this election has been stolen, illegitimate, and it's going to be given to someone who doesn't deserve it, meaning the Democrats. And I think when you see that dynamic combined with all the vulnerabilities of the pandemic, which, higher anxieties and insecurities and more economic distress, meaning this is not economic insecurity itself, right? Not the most disenfranchised who are coming, but people who feel they're entitled to something and that it's slipping away, and that converts to a sense of anger and betrayal at the government. And that has drawn in a lot more older people than we typically see. And I think some of that also has to do with QAnon, which was a big part of January 6th, and which has attracted both older people to it and more women. And so a lot of the women who are attracted to QAnon both come in as mothers who are actually really believe the core conspiracy about child trafficking and feel like they're being heroic and rescuing, but also because there's some QAnon movement happening within communities where there are predominantly women, like surprisingly within yoga communities and non-traditional medicine communities, for example. They call this pastel QAnon, where people who are already suspicious of mainstream institutions, let's say, have been brought in, sometimes even through anti-vax communities, right? This intersection of anti-establishment, I guess, has drawn in some women. And so, but we also saw more women in the militias on January 6th. So it's not just the QAnon and the Trump voters bringing in women. We are seeing women more engaged in violent action. So, what happened on January 6th that was extraordinarily unique for the US context anyway, is that the far right spectrum, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the unlawful militias, the Proud Boys, the QAnon, conspiracy theorists, that entire spectrum has always been very fragmented in the US. There's a lot of infighting. In fact, when you look back at the Charlottesville rally in 2017, it was called Unite the Right. That was the name of the rally because they were trying to unite the right across those infighting, and they failed. It didn't work. They had another rally a year later that called Unite the Right 2, and almost nobody showed up. It just didn't work. They remained totally fragmented. But on January 6th, it did work. The right was united across this disparate spectrum, even if it was just spontaneous. And I think that's where you start to see a lot more diversity in who was there, because you had so many different groups present who draw in different kinds of people.
I think this is really interesting, though, because the element that I'm missing at the moment, Professor Miller-Idriss, is why was it different? Because I think that your explanation that the Charlottesville Unite the Right attempt was not successful. On the other hand, from the perspective of the far right, January 6th was successful in a certain sense, because there was a unification in or maybe more communication. Maybe that's the issue. But I'd like to pass that question back to you. What has changed over time?
I think sorry, go ahead.
Besides, of course, all the political scenario that you described.
Yes. I think what happened on January 6th was they still don't agree. All of these groups still don't agree on their own objectives, essentially, but they unified around one core theme, which was this conspiracy about the election being stolen from them, and so they really unified. They found a common thread that cuts across, and so it was like the lowest common denominator, that we say in mathematics. They may not have the same objectives overall. Some are pushing for a white ethno-state, others are pushing for no taxes or no shelter-in-place order or whatever it is. They think there's a cabal of organized elites, running a child trafficking ring. Like, they may not all agree about these things, but they agreed on that day that there was a need to stop that certification of the Electoral College process and interrupt the democratic process that they believed was illegitimate. And so they found a common thread, and that did unite them in action on that day, along with mobilized mob of Trump voters who were united in the action that day too. So you had the planned militia, the planned extremists who came tactically prepared to storm the Capitol. And then you had the mobilized individuals who, turned fire extinguishers into weapons on that day. They're both criminally liable, but they weren't necessarily both planning in the same exact way to do what they did. And I think that they united in that same kind of opportunity, I guess, to storm the Capitol, shows that they couldn't have done it, I think, without as many people showed. They wouldn't, any one of those little groups wouldn't have been able to do it on their own. The mobilized Trump mob was pretty large, but it took the backdrop of a riot in order for those other groups to actually have the success that they deemed they had to do it. They weren't going to be able to achieve that on their own. And I think that's where the risk of them seeing the success of having combined forces and getting over their disagreements on that one day to be able to move forward with a common task, I think is what we saw. So it really was this mass disinformation, a universe of disinformation and false information about the election that I think unified them.
Okay, thanks. And I think you also argue in what I know from your writing that with that situation now, the awareness that could have been there before is now created, and that you compare Germany to the US a lot, of course, with the work that you have done. But I would like to ask you, so what is the reaction now? Because we are waiting for the report that President Biden has asked for. So do you see a difference now to the reaction to what happened in 2017 with the different administration, of course?
There's definitely a difference. I think that the difference builds on, there had been, not just after Charlottesville, but after Christchurch, after El Paso and Pittsburgh, after the terrible terrorist attacks that happened in between, let's say, this mobilization to violence, there had been a number of hearings before Congress that even looked at things like white supremacist extremism in the military and law enforcement, as well as global connections. So there was growing awareness, and that essentially led to the Department of Homeland Security in October of 2020, their annual threat assessment report did designate domestic violent extremism and white supremacist extremism in particular as what they call the most persistent and lethal threat facing the nation. So I think on the intelligence side and on the academic side, the awareness was there, the awareness was there. The threat assessment wasn't taken seriously, though, by law enforcement or authorities on the ground, or by the public, I really think, who just didn't think that, so there was a lot of intelligence saying this risk was there, this was likely to happen. And so that's why I say, for someone like me, I was not surprised at all by January 6th, but still it was shocking, right? It can't not be shocked by that, but it was not surprising. But I think in the reaction to it afterward, we have seen the administration now take it up in a way that we didn't have that kind of urgency before. I think the administration does understand the potential, and we don't know exactly what the report, that initial report will bring. There's a lot of dialogue happening right now, a lot of back channel discussions, a lot of conversations. What I think my biggest concern and what I see happening right now is that the reaction is almost entirely seeing this as a problem of law enforcement and security and intelligence. And that's where the resources are likely to go, into better improving intelligence assessments, more money for security. We're already spending $2 million a week just on the extra security at the Capitol alone, not to mention, the rest of the militarized situation that we're in DC right now. And after January 6th, I mean, the bridges had military checkpoints. It was an unbelievable, kind of situation. And so my concern is, if that's the future, what's the alternative to that future, I guess? And can we see a world in which we invest at least as much in interventions and prevention, in resources for young people, in trying to understand and stem the misinformation and the disinformation? And there's some discussion of that, but in my mind, not enough compared to the just the kinds of people who are, it's really terrorism experts, essentially, who are being called upon to provide the analysis, and pivoting from other kinds of terrorism, which makes some sense, but also not just seeing this as a security and law enforcement problem, but one that has to be addressed through the kinds of integrated attention to racism, to discrimination, to the relationships between some of the underlying roots of white supremacy and the outcome of white supremacist extremism.
I understand, but I still think that the acknowledgement of law enforcement as an important instrument is something that is really important in the US and also in Germany, because we have talked about the young people that are drawn into that. And when we had our kind of private conversation before, you mentioned that you still have the data of those that you interviewed 20 years ago. And it would be really interesting to see what happened to these extreme far right followers at that time, what they are today. But with the structural and the individual, I think there's one question, because there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience already. And I think one fits perfect now. So I'm hitting on that question, because I think it also ties in with your two approaches to the topic, your bottom up approach and your top down. And the question is the following: in the politically motivated attack on the Capitol building, former and current military and police were involved. Is this a problem of disaffection? And which individuals in particular are buying into radicalization, and why? I think you covered this partly with the explanation of how brands and all these attractive elements come in, the cultural elements, but there's more to say about that, I guess.
There's a lot to say about this. I mean, what we have in the States is a great question, is finally a very, very belated acknowledgement happening, I think, on two fronts. One, we're in the middle of a national reckoning about race and police brutality, as you know, I think is pretty clear. And in the wake of George Floyd's killing last year and the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly protests over the summer. And so the new attention to the way that bias, conscious or unconscious bias, plays a role in thinking even about who is a threat, right? And taking threat assessments and intelligence reports seriously. So I think even these questions about the utter failure of law enforcement to take the threats, the very real intelligence reporting seriously about January 6th, that was a known possible outcome on January 6th. And still you have, instead of people, the Capitol Police showing up in riot gear, the way that they showed up when Black Lives Matter protests happened over the summer, they showed up in regular uniforms, and so who's deemed to be a threat, I think, and what is taken seriously as a potential danger is, and who's taken danger, it really is an important part of this. That's the bias side of it. The other side is the actual infiltration and conscious and deliberate engagement of members of law enforcement or of the military and the veteran community in right-wing extremist groups and far-right extremist groups, both on the unlawful militia side and on the white supremacist extremist side. And the real problem there in the States is that what we have had for decades is anecdote after anecdote after anecdote that tells stories that this happens, that there are a couple of law enforcement members here or there that, were members of a Ku Klux Klan group, or just this week now, just this morning, reporting that the law enforcement spokesperson in the Atlanta shooting case had posted on his own social media sites recommending people buy T-shirts that were linking the virus to China, right? So, kind of anti-Asian and hateful T-shirts that another former law enforcement person was selling. So, these stories, we have these stories and anecdotes, but we have never had proper data collection or transparency about that back to the public. And so we don't have the equivalent, like what Germany has, of a dedicated military agency that reports and is charged with rooting out extremism in the military. We have nothing like that. So what we have had now is a Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, order a stand down, it's called, in the 60 days following the middle of January. So it's really happening right now. Every military agency required to spend some time, stand down from all other activities to investigate and discuss extremism. But we don't really know what that means or whether there's been any transparency yet. There hasn't been back to the public on how that was done. And so we know that there will be new questions asked, that there will be probably, incoming strategies to address and interrogate maybe even social media pages of new members and maybe even periodic checking of that. But whether there will be transparency back to the public or reporting is still very unclear. And finally, we still don't know whether, even if you do interrogate the issues in the military, if you dismiss those people from the military, are there more supports for veterans affairs and veterans communities now because they become veterans who were also overrepresented? I think 20% of the arrests so far for the Capitol are people with military experience. So that is obviously within the veterans community a huge problem. So there's multiple levels. And I think, Germany's having its own scandals over the last year or two about the military and intelligence and security and law enforcement engagement in right-wing extremism, and has now been doing a national investigation of this, which I think is a model for what could be done, not just in the US, but globally, to really pay attention to it and interrogate it. I mean, the percentages are relatively small, I think, of what we're looking at overall. It's certainly less than 1% in the data that's come out so far. But, I always bear in mind what the German defense minister said, which is, every case is a scandal. You have people who are charged with safeguarding the public and who have military training or law enforcement training, specialized training, and they should be held to a higher standard, not just, the same standard as everyone, and certainly not a lower standard. So I think we are just scratching the surface of this issue in the States. And the fact that we don't even have, where we are in the States on this is we don't even agree on the terms that should be used. So even our own agencies, the Department of Justice and the Department of State, use the term racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. Department of Homeland Security and Congress are using white supremacist extremism. Even in our own federal agencies, we don't have shared terminology, much less data collection across the states that can tell us what's happening. So we are at the beginning of a process, I think, that will be, a generation of work.
And as you have just mentioned, I think we are in the same situation in Germany, that we still have to improve, and that even if we might have a more precise terminology on what's going on, it's still worrying that there might be increases in all these different varieties, I would say, of hate crimes, if that is the broad category. And actually, we have a couple of questions concerned with these, with the issue of numbers and increases, and how do we measure and relate to what is going on. And one goes out to what you have mentioned already, the shooting in the Atlanta area. I think there is a massive increase, and you have written about that also, Professor Miller-Idriss, in anti-Asian or anti-Asian hate crimes, probably due to the dealing with the COVID crisis, but maybe you have a better or a broader explanation than that. And there's one question connected to that, which I would like to pass on to you. Could you elaborate a bit on the intersection between misogyny and far-right extremism and radicalization, especially in light of the murders of Asian women in Atlanta? So that is the specific angle to that question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm so glad to hear it. And I think there is growing, I think just this morning I read that misogyny is now a hate crime in the UK. So this is really like of the moment. There's a global change in the way that misogyny is being treated as part of the far right spectrum. I still see a lot of people, analysts, and also government agencies, not including male supremacism, misogyny as part of far right extremism, which I think is a mistake. So, the way I define far right extremism, there are lots of different things going on, anti-democratic, anti-state kinds of attitudes, but and the use of violence. But one core aspect is some sort of set of beliefs in a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority across groups, and that gets defined in different ways. So we do have white supremacy, Christian supremacy, so-called Western chauvinism or Western supremacy that we see like in the Proud Boys, for example. Supremacy by sexuality, right? There's all different kinds, but one type is male supremacy, and these are beliefs that there's superiority and inferiority across groups, and that there's some kind of entitlement given back to those in the superior group over the others, and it leads to or can lead to dehumanization. And the misogyny is very clearly a part of that. And so what we see, and the case in Atlanta is still the details are coming out about it. So, I'm saying that I'm speaking from media reports here, and I think a lot still has to come out officially. But I just had a thread about this on Twitter this morning, really explaining why I think it's important to understand in the social context, even if it's not in the official justification, why the misogyny and racism can be intertwined and what that looks like. So what you have here is a case where ostensibly a young man who's arrested, and gives misogynist and male supremacist explanations for the crime, namely sexual addiction, and blaming the women. So the idea here is that he's entitled to a life in which he's not tempted by the distraction from women who tempt him sexually. And so that's where the violence comes from. And that is the classic male supremacist and misogynist kind of approach, right? Which positions women as the ones who have to be responsible for keeping men safe from their own desires. And but in this case, we also have a hypersexualization in the broader cultural context of Asian women in particular, and even a fetishization of Asian women within the far right that's well documented. And so along with this astronomical or very high number, 3,800 of documented hate crimes against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community in the US since the start of COVID pandemic in 2020 of March. So I think you have to look at that broader cultural context in the sense of, you know, does a person's articulated explanation for their own violence, even if that's, you know, doesn't get designated a hate crime because of the way hate crime laws are understood. We, as understanding the broader cultural context, the way that bias works, the way that desire in this case might be working, have to understand those things as intertwined. And I think it's about cultural context and those intersections rather than just what somebody explains from their own head about their justification. So again, with all the caveats that this is an ongoing investigation and we don't know exactly how that will unfold, I think it's really important to understand the intertwining of racism and misogyny in both these cases, and importantly, to recognize misogyny as a hate crime. But right now, women are not a protected group in the same way. So there wouldn't be, I think, you don't have the same kinds of hate crime designations in the US. This makes it complicated. But in the UK, as of this morning, I read now misogyny is a hate crime. And so I think this is at least to recognize the male supremacy and misogyny as part of the far right spectrum, and understanding that just what gets defined as a hate crime itself shouldn't shape our complete understanding of what might possibly be a broader cultural context in which those crimes get enacted.
I would like to frame a question in addition to that. Professor Miller-Idriss, do you think that in approaching these complicated themes of which kind of historical hierarchies are used in these contexts, should that be a scholarly approach or rather an approach that deals with the victims and maybe talks with victim communities, or how is that best understood? I think that's my question.
I think it's a really great question. And actually one thing that both Germany and New Zealand are doing really well, I think, or better than others, is centering the experiences, at least on paper, centering the experiences of victims, of survivors, and in the German case of migrant communities, and thinking about these 89 measures, for example, as combating not just right-wing extremism, but also racism, right? So it's a combination of those things, and having extensive dialogue with migrant communities and members from migrant communities as part of that conversation. And we see that in the Christchurch report as well, that there's a very strong survivor and victim-centered approach. And I do think it's really important it's essential to have victim-centered approaches. And it's one of the things that I think has frustrated me about this reaction to the Atlanta is you see this coming from a lot of Asian Americans saying, but this is, it is also racism. And then, to only talk about it because of this is the official, kind of explanation that can be documented. We saw the same thing actually with Oklahoma City in 1995. The Oklahoma City bombing is and will probably always be officially classified as an anti-government extremist crime in the US, right? It's Timothy McVeigh as an anti-government extremist. That was the documented justification and explanation. But he was also a white supremacist. And so we have to understand these intersections and intertwining, even if the official justification of something is one thing, the racism intersects and influences people's own ideas about their entitlement, about superiority and inferiority, about sense of betrayal, and all of those things. I think that's what I mean by the broader cultural context, and understanding it through a lens that comes into dialogue with victims, with survivors, with ethnic minority communities, I think makes that clearer than coming at it only from the perspective of the majority.
Thank you very much. And I have to send out my apology to you out in the public audience, because we still have a list of questions,
Sure.
and I think we will not be able to cover them all because our time is almost over. But there is one, and I think we should talk about Germany. So this fits in very well, because you talked about the cultural context and superiority and inferiority, and the cultural context in Germany might be different from the American one, but this question is a little different, so I'll just read it out. I'm quite concerned about new far-right nationalism in Germany, and was wondering whether there are actual factual numbers we can put around the phenomenon of growing far-right extremism and increasing attraction to violent movements, or is this circumstantial evidence? When I argue the case with my friends, many find these trends have always existed and to some degree, and there is no increase.
Actually, in Germany, you can really clearly document, and I think the numbers this year are because the Verfassungsschutzbericht, the annual report on the Office of the Protection of the Constitution, reports these numbers very clearly. And Germany has a different kind of intelligence data gathering structure. So I think the numbers for 2020 were 32,080 right-wing extremists. And the year before it was 24,100. So there's a clear documented increase that can be actually very easily tracked in Germany of the official case numbers. I think what's much harder to document, and one of the things that first of all, we can't do that at all in the US. We have no way of tracking that kind of information because we don't collect that kind of data. But there are a number of other measures. And essentially what I usually say is on every measure we have available, we've seen increases. So you can track the number of plots foiled by the FBI. You can track the number of hate crimes, the amount of propaganda circulating, the numbers of hate crimes against different groups like Asian Americans and how that's gone up and increased. And the same thing is true in Germany in terms of tracking hate incidents, violent incidents, propaganda circulating, plots foiled. You can track those same kinds of things. And globally, we know from the Global Terrorism Index that there's a 250% increase in right-wing terror just over the past 5 years in Western Europe, North America, and Oceania. So basically, the data is really, really clear on the increases that are officially tracked. What's harder to track is what's happening outside of groups and outside of violent incidents. And that's the part that I study. And, I think that increase in incidents, for example, the terror incidents, that 250% increase, we also know that only 13% of incidents of far-right terror globally are attributed to members of back to an actual group, like somebody who was a part of a real group. So far on January 6th, it's somewhere between 13 and 15% of those arrested are members of actual groups. So we often focus on groups, and they are important. They spread propaganda, people follow them, they admire them, they have their social media group, but it's a much more amorphous kind of thing than it used to be in the 1980s or 1990s, when you really had to go find a group to be a part of this. Because the way social media works and the way that online spaces work, you can be just as easily exposed and self-radicalize yourself, even if you're not a part of a group. And those people are very difficult you can't count them. How would you know? You can look at the numbers of Telegram channels, the numbers of people signing up for Parler, for different kinds of free speech platforms, or for Gab, which is, more toxic. And those numbers are large, and, but you don't know how many of them are journalists, how many of them are researchers, how many you can't really track. So we have to really track kind of official measures, and then understand that that's underpinned by what is probably a much broader and bigger cultural context of online spaces that support, that sympathize, and that underpin it.
There has also been a question, I think, that fits quite in about younger and older groups. So I think that your argument is really relevant, that the groups are not the only entity to focus on. But since there is a question about differences between younger and older groups or members of groups.
Yeah, I mean, the older groups are, especially in the white supremacist extremist side, the older groups are still much more focused on traditional white, sort of National Socialism and traditional white supremacist historical kinds of ideas. They sometimes promote something like a white ethno-state, but more modern groups, I mean, they have a better aesthetic, I will say, meaning better, like a more modern and harder to recognize aesthetic. It's not always just the black, white, red of the Nazi flag. It's one of the reasons, as Frau Zwingenberger mentioned, the covers of my books. It was really important to me that the covers of those books not be black, white, and red, because almost every book on the far right is black, white, and red. Usually has someone with a shaved head and, Springerstiefel, black combat boots on it. And I really wanted to signify that this is not that. And even on the cover of our Parents and Caregivers Guide, the graphic designer first came up with a concept that just showed like a head with, radicalization happening inside the head. It was like the brain. And, we really pushed back and said, we want to show something different. It's not just happening inside people's heads. It's right in the mainstream spaces and places. And so that got changed to a scene of a family sitting on a couch and a child on an iPad right there, like on the floor nearby. Like it could be right under your nose and you might not know it, kind of thing. So a little bit more of a haunting image. So we're trying to, in the iconography that I even use to explain and reflect it, make sure that that reflects what I think is the modern scene. And I think you see that in the iconography of like identitarian groups, the colors they choose, the imagery they choose compared to older groups. And certainly in the language, let's soften it now by using remigration instead of deportation, right? So there's all kinds of language that is softer and that tries to obscure some of the meanings in the more modern groups compared to what older groups were saying and doing.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Miller-Idriss. I think this is, it's too bad, but it's the end of our public part of the event. But I would suggest if people want to learn more about the mainstreaming aspect, and we didn't really have a chance to talk about political parties and mainstreaming, because I think that's also an issue, especially in Germany on the far right. How much are political parties also using these elements that you have just described of mainstreaming and family ideals and so on. Whoever wants to find out more, go back to your book, or can go back to your book or the information material that you have on your website. And therefore, I would wish everybody in the audience a good afternoon, and thank you for your attention. And ask the students to stay with us for more questions and more Q&A with Professor Miller-Idriss in just a second.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the audience.